Hello everyone and welcome. In this tutorial, I will show you how to deploy and manage Windows containers. There are three parts in this tutorial. In the first one, we will install and configure Windows Server Container Host. In the second part, we will install and configure Docker. And in the last part, we will learn how to download and install a container-based image, and then how to use that container-based image in order to deploy a Windows container. So let's get started. First, for the Windows Server that I will use as a Windows Server container host, I am going to create a new server. So we're not going to use any of these servers that we created during our lab environment setup. And instead, I will go ahead. This is my Windows Server 2016 desktop experience, or GUI, clean install. So I haven't done anything in this server. I just created and installed a Windows Server 2016, no housekeeping, no nothing. I'll go ahead, right click and clone it. So I'll go manage, clone. Next, next, create a full clone. Next, I'll call it Windows Server 2016 container host. Container host, all right, and finish. So now we are cloning this container host that we will be using to install the container feature. Now, while this is cloning, it's important to note that if we are going to install a Hyper-V containers, then we would need to install Hyper-V on this container host. But for this tutorial, we're not going actually to be deploying Windows Server Hyper-V isolated containers. Instead, we will install Windows Server containers, and so we will only install the containers feature. So let me just repeat this, make sure it's clear. In our lecture notes, we have noticed that there are Hyper-V containers and there are Windows Server containers. In this tutorial, we are going to be using Windows Server containers, and so we won't need to install Hyper-V. I am going to pause the recording until the cloning finish, and then we'll pick up from there. Alright, so the cloning has just finished. Go ahead and click close. And before we fire up this container host, there's one important setting that we need to do, and that's enabling virtualization at the processor level. So go ahead and click VM settings for this specific VM, our container host. Go to processor and make sure you enable this option, the virtualization engine for the processor. You cannot enable this while the server is up and running. You have to shut down your server first and then enable this option. Go ahead and click OK. Now we're ready to fire up our server. Go ahead and start this virtual machine. All right. Go ahead and log in. Give it a moment to load the server manager and all the services. As you can see in here, if you go to the local server, you can see this machine is not a part of a domain or a domain controller or anything, just a basic Windows Server 2016. I just want to make sure that there is internet access, so I'll go ahead, check the IP configuration. And so I have 129. I will use this IP that was dynamically assigned to the server to assign it in as statically. So I'll go here, click Ethernet properties. If you know you have internet connectivity, you don't need to do this. 192.168.0.129, and my gateway is 192.168.2.2, and my DNS, I'm using Google DNS. I'll go ahead and click OK. Right, the gateway is not right. So I meant .2 in here, and OK, OK, and close. You have to make sure that you have internet access. And there you go. All right. So now go ahead to the server manager and let's add the containers feature. Add roles and features. Give it a next, another next. Server selection. We are selecting this server, the default one, the one we're working at. Server roles. We're going to give it a next. And now under features, there's this option here that says containers. When we add this feature, this is what makes our server is a Windows Server host container. So we are going to add this feature. Click next. Choose the start the destination server automatically if required. Yes, and install. Once the installation finishes, our Windows Server Containers host will be ready. As you can see, it did actually need a restart after the containers feature installation. All right, so I will go ahead and log in. And that's it. That's the end of our first part. Now we do have our Windows Server Containers host ready, and we are ready to install and configure Docker, and then start downloading a base image container, and then using that base image container in order to deploy Windows Server Containers. Thank you for listening. I will see you in our next part.